Hello students, welcome to our continued discussion on Ta-Nehisi Coates' Case for Reparations. This discussion will cover section 8, part 8 of his essay. One thing to note, as we begin our discussions of part 8 and 9, these are the parts of the essay where Coates really expresses his ideological beliefs for reparations and expresses the point that reparations are more than just financial. So if you're really trying to figure out what his main point is about the benefits of reparations, sections 8 and 9 are where he truly expresses those. So if we begin our discussion of section 8, we discuss this notion of how white poverty is different from black poverty, or as it's quoted in the essay, Negro poverty. So this concept, Coates here is drawing upon quotes done by the former US President Lyndon B. Johnson about how there are differences in analyzing how poverty affects African Americans and how poverty affects white Americans. What this quote recognizes and what Coates wants us to think is that there are, as he said previously in the essay, ecologically distinct reactions in terms of poor African Americans and poor white people. This idea of the differences in poverty continues Coates' point that African Americans face different and more extreme challenges than people of similar income levels. So a poor working class African American faces different and more extreme challenges than a poor working class white American. And that these differences are done, in Coates' view, due to racial inequalities. And if we ignore the fact that white poverty is handled, discussed, given aid in different ways than black poverty, we join in with Coates' critique of any type of analysis that looks at the problems of America and is loath to invoke white supremacy as an explanation for anything. Essentially, Coates here is speaking towards people who would critique his own essay by saying that it's not really about race when he is giving you an essay filled with lots of evidence to try and say, yes, very much it is totally about race when we're talking about issues of poverty and working conditions. So after setting up that initial distinction, Coates discusses this notion of an injury gap when it comes to white and African Americans. Building off his idea that there are qualitative differences in the nature of poverty between white and African Americans, Coates argues that to ignore this idea of an injury gap, to ignore the idea and existence of racial exploitation and inequality as a driving factor in African American lives, is to cover up the sin of natural plunder with the sin of national lying. The lie ignores the fact that closing the achievement gap will do nothing to close the injury gap, in which black college graduates suffer higher unemployment rates than white college graduates, and black job applicants without criminal records enjoy roughly the same chance of getting hired as white applicants with criminal records. So what Coates is talking to and discussing here is that if we look at all of the data, the socioeconomic data around African American achievement, education levels, wealth, income, employment rates, all of these sorts of things, he's saying that we can't understand these large gaps, these major differences, the things that make African American poverty different from white poverty, without recognizing the quiet plunder of racial exploitation and racial bigotry, right? So that any simple attempt to change laws or address issues of education or housing or whatever, if none of these take into account this quote-unquote injury gap, the years of quiet plunder Coates outlines in his essay, that this is doomed to be ineffective. It won't change the actual structure. It will just be another example of a sort of repealing of the Jim Crow laws. it will just turn the quiet plunder into even a more silent version, right? It's only by addressing the injury gap, all right, the long history that he outlines, that the U.S. could begin to make reparations, make amends, and move towards true equality between people of color and white Americans. So he says if we talk about achievement gaps, educational gaps, and all these other things when talking about the differences between the two races, we have to talk about the injury gap caused by white supremacy attitudes and racial exploitation. So to puncture and underline this point, quotes ends section 8 with a quote from a man, Billy Brooks. Right? Much like Clyde Ross and Ethel Weatherspoon and Mattie Lewis, Billy Brooks is another person that Coates uses to humanize his ideology of the injury gap, to humanize his concept of an injury gap. All right, he uses Billy Brooks to put a face to this, to have somebody describe what this injury gap looks like on a real interpersonal level. So Brooks describes this ideology of an injury gap, this ideology of white supremacist attitudes, this ideology of the quiet plunder of racial exploitation as a message that tells African Americans this: you, speaking about African Americans, ain't shit. The only thing you are worth is working for us. You will never own anything. You're not going to get an education. They're telling you no matter how hard you struggle, no matter what you put down, you ain't shit. We're going to take what you got. You will never own anything. So Brooks here is expressing on a personal and individual level the way that Coates would be describing things like the injury gap, on-contract buying, racial terror, racial exploitation in terms of working conditions, living conditions, all of the evidence he provides you, all of the history he has given you throughout the previous 7 chapters. Billy Brooks is kind of giving a voice to how that makes individual people feel. That even if it might be hard sometimes for people to understand this notion of an injury gap or wrap their heads around the difference between white and black poverty, what Coates is saying is that on an individual level, African Americans can feel that. They get the message that is being transmitted to them, that you will not be on a level playing field. You will not get the opportunities provided to people who are white. You are, as it says, ain't shit. So it's a reaffirmation. So Billy Brooks is reaffirming here the message of what that system of quiet plunder gives him. He is telling you the feelings that, as an individual, all of the economic concerns, all of the housing concerns, all of the numbers and data in terms of Social Security and other things that Coates presents to you in a very academic manner, this interview with Billy Brooks is supposed to make you understand how that is felt on an individual level, all right? How that injury gap is felt by individual people. So Brooks' quote is meant to humanize all of these things that Coates mentions in his essays, just like Clyde Ross humanizes them for you, just like Mattie Lewis and Ethel Weatherspoon humanize those to you. They put the story, the individual person's story, to the history and data that Coates is providing. So that is why Chapter 8 ends with this powerful message of how it feels to be on the receiving end of the quiet plunder of racial bigotry and racial exploitation. We will pick up this discussion with Section 9 in the next video.